Well, I think the issue is that the terrorists believe it's effective, and therefore I believe we have to similarly take it seriously that terrorists are convinced they can win certainly short-term tactical gains. I mean, the most basic one being attracting attention to themselves and their cause by using violence, and that happens all the time. The question is whether it's more expedient as a long-term strategy. And there, I think, fortunately for history, the answer is no. But the problem is the exceptions that do exist have been highly consequential exceptions, where terrorism, if it hasn't changed the course of history, has had a profound impact on the outcome of history. For instance, the assassination of the heir to the Habsburg throne that set in motion the events that led to World War I. The series of terrorist attacks that sparked the 1967 Six-Day War in the Middle East. One could even argue the tragic beheading of James Foley by ISIS last September, which sparked the United States to re-engage and re-intervene in Iraq, which was something President Obama said would never happen. So that's why I think we have to understand terrorist powers. It may not be successful. Its perpetrators believe that even if it isn't now, it will be eventually. But the point is a strategy of provocation or as a means to spark a wider conflagration or an escalation of violence. And that also is often the terrorist goal. Unfortunately, it has proven effective on occasion, but those occasions have been significant. Yes, I think terrorism certainly played a role in the establishment of Israel. I would say, or I'd have to say, that terrorism is never monocausal. There's always a concatenation or an array of factors that contribute to one outcome. I think, generally speaking, the role of terrorism is often ignored in the creation of any nation state because, after all, terrorism is not something that's good. Terrorism, the word itself, has an enormously negative connotation. And terrorists don't call themselves terrorists. They call themselves everything else: armies, brigades, battalions. They use military terms, or Al-Qaeda, the base, or the Islamic State. So they themselves don't want to use the term, and you can understand why it is eschewed as a factor. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't play some role. And what I've tried to do in the book Anonymous Soldiers is not claim that terrorism created Israel, but nonetheless to focus and to highlight on the role or the contribution that terrorism did made in the factors that persuaded the British to leave Palestine and allow the creation of the State of Israel. Yes, I think that's an element of terrorism that people don't appreciate. We tend to look at terrorists as these mindless, wild-eyed fanatics when, in fact, there is almost always a strategic logic to terrorism. I mean, terrorists don't do things unthinkingly. Terrorism, I mean, that's why terrorism is effective, because it's often choreographed or orchestrated to attract attention to a group and its cause, or to provoke a response from a government that they hope will prove, that the terrorists hope will prove useful to their own cause. So in that sense, I think terrorism was appealing from both sides, by Arabs and Jews, to put pressure on the British, because they came to believe from the earliest days of British rule in Palestine that the British could be influenced, intimidated, or persuaded by violence, including terrorism, and that this terrorism had proven to be effective in getting the British to reverse or change what were very serious policies. So unfortunately, this created a cycle where others believe violence pays. Well, I think the one interesting dimension of the way terrorism was fought then and now is that even though the weapons and means of warfare have changed enormously from the 1940s to today, there weren't drones or cruise missiles or $200 billion fighter aircraft or a lot of the technology, GPS, things that are used in warfare today. And interestingly, even though if warfare has changed as states fight it, the warfare, the violence that terrorists use has remained pretty similar. I mean, it's still the gun and the bomb, much like it was in the 1940s. So that stayed the same. I think what's changed, unfortunately, is that terrorism more and more, and especially in the 21st century, has become directed against civilian targets to a greater extent than was the case in the past. And we see that many terrorist groups now, civilians aren't just a byproduct or accidental or collateral damage, but often inflicting harm on civilians is in fact the rationale of terrorists today, and that's very unfortunate and very tragic.